This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Warlord of Kor by Terry Carr. Recorded by Julian Jameson. Chapter 6. They left Horng sitting dully at the edge of the flat, and retraced their steps through the Hirlaji ruins, still drawing no notice from the aliens. Rheinison had been in some of the small planetfall towns, where settlements had been established only to be abandoned by the main flow of interstellar traffic. Those backwater areas where contact with the parent civilization was so slight that an entirely local culture had developed, almost as different from that of the mainstream Terran colonies as was this last vestige of the Hirlaji civilization. And in some of those areas interest in Earth was so slight that the off-worlders were ignored, as the Earthmen were here. But he had never felt the total lack of attention that was here. It was not as though the Hirlaji had seen the Earthmen and grown used to them. Rheinison had the feeling that to the Hirlaji the Earthmen were no more important than the winds, or the dust beneath their feet. As they passed through the settled portion of the ruins, Rheinison had to step around a Hirlaji who crossed his path. He walked silently past, his eyes not even flickering toward the earthlings. Crazy gray hide piles, Rheinison thought, and he and Mara hurried out across the flat toward the nearby Earth town. On the outskirts of the town, where the packed dirt streets faded into loose dust and garbage was already piled several feet high, they were met by René Malhomme. He sat long-legged with his back leaning against a weathered stone outcropping. He seemed old already, though he was not yet 50. His wind-blown hair was almost the color of the surrounding gray dust and rock, perhaps because it was filled with that dust, Rheinison thought. He stopped and looked down at the worn, tired man whose eyes belied that weariness. "And have you communicated with God, Lee Rheinison?" Malhomme asked, with his rumbling, sardonic voice. Rheinison met his gaze, wondering what he wanted. He lowered the telepather pack from his shoulder and set it in the dust. Mara sat on a low rock beside him. "Will an alien god do?" Rheinison said. Malhomme's eyes rested on the telepather for a moment. "You spoke with Kor?" he asked. Rheinison nodded slowly. "I made a linkage with one of the Hirlaji and tapped the race memory. I suppose you could say I spoke with Kor." "You have touched the alien godhead," Malhomme mused. "Then it's real. Their god is real." "No," said Rheinison. "Kor is a machine." Malhomme's head jerked up. "A machine? Deus ex machina, to quote an ancient curse. We make our own machines, and make gods of them." The tired lines of his face relaxed. "Well, that's a bit better. The gods remain a myth, and it's better that way." Rheinison stood over him on the windy flat, still puzzled by his manner. He glanced at Mara, but she too was watching Malhomme, waiting for him to speak again. Suddenly Malhomme laughed, a dry laugh which almost rasped in his throat. "Lee Rheinison, I have called men to God for so long that I almost began to believe it myself. And when the men started talking about the god of these aliens—" He shook his head, the spent laughter still drawing his mouth back into a grin. "Well, I'm glad it isn't true. Religion wouldn't be worth a damn if it were true." "How did the men find out about Kor?" Rheinison asked. Malhomme spread his hands. "Manning has been talking, as usual. He ridicules the Hirlaji and their god, and at the same time he says they are a menace." "Why? Is he still trying to work the townsmen up against them?" "Of course. Manning wants all the power he can get. If it means sacrificing the Hirlaji, he'll do it." Malhomme stood up, stretching himself. "He says they may be the outsiders, and he's stirring up all the fear he can. He'll grab any excuse, no matter how impossible." "It's not so impossible," Rheinison said. "Kor is an outsider's machine." Malholm stared at him. "You're sure of that?" He nodded. "There's no doubt of it. I saw it from 3 feet away." He told Malholm of his linkage with Hornung, the contact with the memories, the mind, Tebron, and of the interview with the machine that was Kor. Malholm listened with fascination, his shaggy head tilted to one side, occasionally throwing in a comment or a question. As he finished, Reinesen said, "That race that Kor warned them about sounds remarkably like us. A warlike race that would crush them if they left the planet. We haven't found any other intelligent life. Just the Hirlaji and us." "And the Outsiders," said Malholm. "No. This was a race which was still growing from barbarism, at about the same level as the Hirlaji themselves. Remember, the Outsiders had already spread through 1,000 star systems, long before this. No, we're the race they were warned against." "What about the weapons?" Malholm said. "Disintegrators. We haven't got anything that powerful that a man can carry in his hand, and yet the Hirlaji had them thousands of years ago." "Yes, but for some reason they couldn't duplicate them. It doesn't make sense. Those weapons were apparently beyond the technological level of the Hirlaji, but they had them." "Perhaps your aliens were the Outsiders," Malholm said. "Perhaps we see around us the remnants of a great race, fallen." Reinesen shook his head. "But they must have had some contact with the Outsiders," Mara said. "Sometime even before Tebron's lifetime. The Outsiders could have left the disintegrators and the machine that they thought was a god." "That's just speculation," Reinesen said. "Tebron himself didn't really know where they'd come from. They'd been passed down through the priesthood for a long time, and within the priesthood they did have some secrets. I suppose if I could search the race memory long enough, I might find another nice big block there, hiding that secret. But it's difficult." "And you may not have time," Malholm said. "When Manning hears that the altar of Kor was an Outsider's machine, there'll be no way left to stop him from slaughtering the Hirlaji." "I'm not sure there'll be any real trouble," Reinesen said. Malholm's lips drew back into the deep lines of his face. "There is always trouble. Always. Whoever or whatever spoke through the machine knew that much about us. The only way you could stop it, Lee, would be to hold back this information from Manning, and to do that you would have to be sure, yourself, that there is no danger from the Hirlaji. You're in the key position right now." Reinesen frowned. He knew Malholm was right. It would be difficult to stop Manning if what he'd said about the man's push for power was true. But could he be sure that the Hirlaji were as harmless as they seemed? He remembered the reassuring touch of Hornung's mind upon his own, the calmness he found in it, and the resignation. But he also remembered the fear, and the screaming, and the hot rush of anger that had touched him. In the silence on the edge of the flat, Mara spoke. "Lee, I think you should report it all to Manning." "Why?" Her face was clouded. "I'm not sure, but when I disconnected the wires of the telepather, Hornung looked at me. Have you ever looked into his eyes? Up close. It's frightening. It makes you remember how old they are, and how strong. Lee, that creature has muscles in his face as strong as most men's arms." "He just looked at you," said Reinesen. "Nothing else." "That's all. But those eyes, they were so deep and so full. You don't usually notice them because they're set so deeply in the shadows of his face, but his eyes are large." She stopped, and shook her head in confusion. "I can't really explain it. When I moved around him to the other side, I could see his eyes following me. He didn't move, otherwise. It was as though only his eyes were alive. But they frightened me. There was much more in them than just not seeing or not caring. His eyes were alive." "That's not much evidence to make you think the Hirlaji are dangerous." "Oh, I don't know if they could be dangerous, but they're not just passive. They're not vegetables. Not with those eyes." "All right," Reinesen said. "I'll give Manning a full report, and we'll put it in his hands." He picked up the telepather pack and slung it over his shoulder. Mara stood up, shaking away the dust which had blown against her feet. "What will you do," Malholm asked, "if Manning decides that's enough cause to kill the Hirlaji?" "I'll stop him," Reinesen said. "He's not in control here, yet." Malholm flashed his sardonic smile again. "Perhaps not. But if you need help, call to God. The books say nothing about alien races, but surely these must be gods